All right, today is Sunday, June 14th. We're going to continue our discussion on civil and courteous dialogue. Today we're looking at intent, impact, and image, and also the difference between spiritual versus legal. All right, so we'll continue on. We already covered the first 2 points. And in point 3, the Bible says, do not judge or you too will be judged. And I want to be clear that I don't believe this means we should never evaluate anything or never provide some sort of judgment. I think we have to be discerning. The Bible uses the term discernment, particularly in the Old Testament, a lot. Just pulled one verse here. This discerning heart seeks knowledge, but the mouth of a fool feeds on folly. And we certainly have a lot of folly going on today in our discourse, and particularly at the intersection of faith and politics. I think we as discerning Christians say, hey, let's get more information. I think what this means, and I'm open to anybody jumping in as well, is that we can assess things, maybe a goodness or badness of a particular action, like here in number 1, but we should always do it with humility. We shouldn't ever go in with arrogance and believe that we are a morally better person than anybody else, or the person we're conversing with or that we're talking about, because I believe that is the situation that is being described here in Matthew 7:1, when Jesus was speaking to the crowds here. So I think that is a way to thread the needle and say we can make evaluations and not do this. I think there's also a difference between denigrating a person's character versus criticizing a person's action. So I don't know if you guys can read this, but maybe Kevin, can you read this quote for us here on the screen?
Sure. Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Stephen Covey, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yep. And have you guys heard this phrase before?
No.
I've not.
Okay, so it was referred to in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which was a bestseller written by Stephen Covey maybe 20 years ago. And then Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of our premier poets in America, I think he was referencing. If you kind of look at this quote, what is the difference between a person's action and a person's character? Can somebody explain or share that with the rest of us?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. So what somebody says is more of a what than a who. And I heard a really good talk this week on anti-racism, and it says that one is not a racist, but what they say or how they act may be racist, doesn't define that they are all that because of an action that they do. So we should clearly look at actions and words instead of immediately jumping to defining a whole person based on something they say or do.
That is a beautiful example, Dawn. I think it's almost perfect. So if you look at this quote, it's the idea of when you sow something, if you sow a seed, you reap this. When you sow more of this, more actions, you reap a habit. A habit is simply an action that's repeated over and over, right? And a character becomes a habit that is repeated over and over. And if you just continue in this character, ultimately becomes repeated through your life and is therefore your destiny. So character is the repetition of actions. But a single action, just because I make a remark like, I think Chinese people are stupid, and I can say that because I'm obviously Chinese, but that doesn't mean that I am a racist. Even though that particular action, you can judge this with this, this, and that, and say, okay, how did that come across? But it doesn't necessarily make me a racist, just like the illustration that you gave, Dawn. So character is the repetition of lots of action. Does that seem to make sense to everybody?
I think so. you hear the phrase, well, gee, that was out of character for that person. And sometimes if you see somebody that you know or whatever, or if you find them in a bad situation, they're agitated because of something else, they may say something and you can think to yourself, wow, that's not the person I know. That's out of character for that person. And I think that happens for all of us. There's situations that we get into where, we react and it's not really our character, but it's just outside influences or something else has affected us at that moment in time. And I think that's where all these videos that you see on television and that people are recording, you never get the full story because they start recording after the initial incident or after the fact has started. And then you see the ramifications of that action, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
I think you're completely right on that as well, right? There are times when we all say things, like most of us pretty good, outstanding Christians, and yet we'll just throw an example. Sometimes, let's say you hit your finger with a nail and you let the D word out, even though we don't really use the D word. That would be generally out of character for us. And I don't want to presume to speak with everybody, because even Lena gets upset when I say Hoover Dam. She doesn't like that. But that could be something that is not our character, but that extenuating circumstance, like you said, Ray, is it provides some context as to why I might have said the D word. But still, if you look at that single action of the D word, I would probably say, okay, I really shouldn't be saying that word, and that's not part of my character. Thank you, Ray, for not judging me too hard. But I say, okay, I want to control my tongue a little bit better. And even though I hit my thumb with a hammer, let me work on that. I appreciate you as a brother for calling me out, but also not judging my character. That would be...
I don't judge it when he swears.
Hoover, damn, well, that's great. Okay. All right, so before we dive into each of these three things, general comments, questions about this framework of intent, impact, image.
Well, I appreciate that quote that you said from Stephen, and because it makes me think of the verses that talk about what's inside comes out. So what's in your heart is what comes out. So the fact that it starts with thoughts. So the repetition is what creates a character. But that's what God says to us. It's what's inside that makes us unclean.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Because we hide it for long, many times. If it's continuous.
Well, and the way that I always try to stay humble is realizing that, if I grew up in that environment, I might be doing the exact same thing, right? So this is where I realize, because, until your faith has been tested, you don't know.
Right.
You really don't know how strong your faith is until it has been tested. Unfortunately, that's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I love what you it starts inside, right? That's exactly phase 2. Love our enemies. This has to start with us. We as Christians have to remember that the love flows from Jesus through us to our community, whether they're left or they're right. It doesn't matter. Other thoughts?
And I would say, just as an add-on, this is not just a great intent, impact, image to evaluate, maybe a single action. It's also a great guideline for helping me when I am trying to make a decision on saying something or doing something.
Yep. Okay, let's kind of keep going into that and see what happens. All right, so the first of the 3 I's is intent. So this is a tough one, but it's a good one. When you are talking with someone, you can always ask them to clarify their intention, right? if you're meeting someone, I would always recommend give them the benefit of the doubt. So if we're having these red-blue dialogues and we don't know whether people are leaning more to the left or leaning more to the right, we don't really know, that they say something like, let's say they say all cops are bad. And before we judge them on their intent, some of us might think that's a bad statement. We might want to ask them, well, what did you mean by that? Is to get their intent. If they truly say 100% cops are bad, no exceptions whatsoever, then we're like, okay, we're going to have a little bit of an interesting time here to work through that. And so asking intent in a live situation is a good thing. Now, if you have some sort of way to look at the history of this person, then you might not even need to ask a question to understand their intent, because the history of what they've said or done can either confirm or deny the particular action that you're facing right in front of you. And so that can also give a clue as to what the intention is. Now, sometimes we can't always, and many times we can't always be face-to-face with somebody. We're actually reading things. And if we're reading not news, but reading analysis and opinion pieces, there's some things we can do to try to, again, judge, not in the sense that we're morally better, but to evaluate a goodness or a badness of a particular action that's being discussed upon in a piece like this. So one tip might be to, if there's no actual quote of the person's intent, where they actually say, I intend to do this, or I take full responsibility for this, or whatever, then we have to use circumstantial evidence, right? Because this would be example of direct evidence. Now we have to move to circumstantial. And this is where we really have to understand logic and rationale of reasonable people, with reasonable people being defined as a jury of 12 people, our peers in the community. How would they view it? It's not the extremes on either side. It's just your average Joe the plumber off the street, Kevin, Rich, whoever, Lee at work. What would they think of this situation? Right? Another tip might be to say, well, okay, I just read this from one piece, but what do some of the sources in the center say? So when we looked at media bias chart, we kind of saw that the more reliable sources generally tended to congregate in the center. It's actually interesting, V-shaped, bell-shaped distribution, where the extremes on the left and the right were less reliable. Not to say that they didn't have any truth, but in general they had more questionable things added onto the action, which is what makes it hard to discern. But the center tends to be less inflammatory, and so looking there might be a good gauge of a person's intention. And then finally, last tip would be looking at the totality of action and words from a particular individual. Again, if we don't know much about them, to say, well, what would this look like to a person, especially if they didn't even know anything about them. So sometimes it's interesting to ask my international friends who aren't as close to U.S. Faith and politics like we are, to say, well, what did you think of this thing that Nancy Pelosi said, or this thing that President Trump said, and kind of get their read, right? So it's kind of an independent read from people who aren't exposed to U.S.-based media or U.S.-based politics and faith. So questions or comments about assessing intent? Okay. All right, so intent is important because it is one aspect of kind of three things we have to evaluate before we can pass some sort of judgment. The next thing is impact. So impact is important because even if there is no bad intent, there can still be a negative impact. And when there's a negative impact, we should be concerned. So certainly if we're in a face-to-face situation, if we are hosting one of our groups in phase 3 and we say something and then we see somebody's face, look like it's really been hurt, that might be, a chance for us to, again, ask a question, say, okay, it looks like your nonverbal is telling me very loudly that something I might have said affected here. Could you explain what happened? You know, well, Rich, when you use the term the final solution, it really hurt me. And I go, okay, what's wrong with the final solution? Well, the final solution is a term that the Nazis used for eliminating all the Jews. That is exactly the precise word. So when you use that, it hits me hard. Oh, well, I didn't know that. That wasn't my intent at all. And so I'll ask you to forgive me. And then is there a better phrase that I could use to not, you know, to not impact me now that I know that? But yeah, my grandmother was a Nazi Holocaust survivor. Would appreciate it if you use maybe finding the ultimate answer as opposed to the final solution. Okay, peace. I can do that for here. Okay, yep. Understand, no harm intended, Rich. Let's move on. Right? So that would be an example. That actually was a real live work example that came up. We had some Europeans with us and some Americans, and one of the Americans did say the term the final solution. I had been aware of it because I had read about World War II, but this person had not. And so we were able to work through an example like that where no bad intent at all, but tough impact, particularly on the Israelis in the room.
Triggers.
Yep. So, and I think sometimes that applies too. And things we say, like a lot of terms, like the left doesn't like us to use, or we have no idea. I'm like, I don't even know what is a safe word anymore. You don't want me to call you he or she or whatever. Look, I'm fine with whatever you want to be called. I'll call you by your name, but I didn't mean anything bad by calling you a she or whatever. Just kind of normal. Okay, I get it. So hopefully that will be something that can help us in our groups here. But you know, if something is hey, it's negative, we have to also assess, is it legitimately negative? Sometimes there are people who want to be negative about everything, and it's really not legitimate, again, from reasonable people looking at it. So the impact has to be a direct result. So for example, the example that we just gave before, we were in a meeting together, an American used the term the final solution to an Israeli. There was a direct result, right? He said that and she felt really bad. But sometimes the impact is frivolous. You guys may have heard the term slippery slope. Slippery slope is a logical fallacy, right? Slippery slope means that just because one thing happens, that means everything else bad that happens after that is results of this first event. Well, that is not true. It is only true if the events are dependent events, meaning like if I flick on this domino, it will hit the next domino for sure, and then I know that all the dominoes go together. That is an example of slippery slope that is not a logical fallacy. But if we said that, you know, all Chinese people eat rice, and Rich is not eating rice today, Rich is therefore not Chinese, that doesn't follow at all, right? So that the eating rice at any one time is not directly tied at all to the phrase that all Chinese people eat rice. Okay, so another example of a frivolous type of legitimacy is, and this is a real life example, we used to lead the youth at another church for many, many years, and we had some people come up to us and said, just knowing that, you know, Rich, you and Lena listen to secular music in your own home causes me to stumble in my walk with God. So we're not listening to, 80s music in front of these people, but they were just questioning our spiritual maturity because we listened to secular music in addition to Christian music in our home. And so eventually that was deemed frivolous, like, okay, you're not even there, so it really doesn't have any impact. So Rich and Lena should be allowed to continue to listen to music in their own home. As long as they agree not to play secular music in church, they should still be okay. Right? That was the ruling we eventually got from the Elder Deacon Board. And then some examples of harm that we need to consider. It's not just physical, but it extends into these other areas as well. So we have to be very careful. Like the final solution was more of a mental thing. an emotional thing, because there's a lot of history in hearing final solution, particularly if you said it in German. But that was very difficult. Some actions that we take could have negative financial impact on somebody or some group of people. Just making an accusation on someone. Say, how many of you guys were around in the Joseph McCarthy days? That was before my time, but I certainly read about it. But just the act of stating that I think Lena is a communist. She's a red Chinese. I mean, just look at her. Without evidence, what would have been the the possible impact on her by her neighbors if they heard Joseph McCarthy, our senator from Wisconsin, say that about her? Could have created some social problems for her, right? And then spiritual as well. So questions about impact.
I think we're prone to jump to conclusions so much of the time. And, the slippery slope thing, even though events aren't connected, it still leads to something. When you think of the protests and the riots, people have the intent of going out to protest, which is fine. You want to carry a sign, you want to tell people that you believe in Black Lives Matter. But then you get a few in the group that say, well, we need to take it a step farther. We need to write it on the sidewalk, or we need to set a fire here to this building to prove that we don't approve of this. And it just seems to take things beyond what they should be. And there's, I guess, instigators that have a other agenda from what the original intent was. And it's hard to separate all these things into the judgments of one person. Because one person you could probably sit down and talk to and get an understanding of where they are and how they feel. But in a crowd or a mob, the mob rules kind of take over. And it's hard to control any type of situation like that.
That's a great point. So remember, in assessing this, we want to go to, keep it as precise as possible.
Okay.
Judging a situation like that, we kind of know that there are statistics around how large groups behave.
Mm-hmm.
We know that large groups, it's trouble. You yell fire in a large group, somebody's going to get trampled, even if there's no particular intent, right? You have a toy that people want for Christmas, somebody's going to get trampled trying to get it if that toy is like a limited release or something. So I think it would be probably good to look at the impact, the intent of the organizers, and then understand what are they trying to do, and then look at the intent of the person who started the say, let's burn this building. And obviously that's a bad intent, and the impact is that the burned building would be bad, and then judge it that way. But it would be improper for us to judge the intent of a protester who only had peaceful intentions, but then another person co-opted it and went and did something different. We'd have to render two judgments there.
Right.
And so we can't let and this comes later, we can't let a non-representative part allow us to make a improper judgment of the whole. And that comes later on, forget whatever that is. Yes. Go ahead. Was that Barb?
Just going to say the one example that slippery slope makes me think of is back when Elmbrook was doing the vote on women elders, and many left the church because there was a fear of a slippery slope. Well, if we do that, then next we're going to be doing this in the church, and then we're going to be doing that, instead of just, even if they agreed with maybe this is an okay thing, there was so much fear based on what was going to happen next, even though and it hasn't. So they didn't maybe choose what was right in the moment because of that slippery slope.
Yeah, that is another very good example, because a gating factor that separates those two events and makes them independent is that there was a single discussion on the role of women at Elmbrook. And then let's say the slippery slope person was arguing, well, then we're going to start marrying animals or whatever. And
Right.
that you would have to have another discussion on whether we agree to marry animals or not, and that would have to be a vote. So that those would be gated and therefore dependent events, independent events. However, if okay, we allow women to play a certain role at Elmbrook, and then by default, then therefore these animals can get married, that would be dependent, and thus that would be valid concern. But obviously, it's the former and not the latter, right? So, okay, so that's impact. And then the last thing here would be image. So the final rubric here is image. And one way to look at this is say, okay, well, how would this look in front of my families and friends? How would it look if I did it at work, school, or at church, or whoever did it at work, school, or church? And how would it look if it's published in the Journal Sentinel or Badger News or USA Today or whatever, and say, okay, just let's see what does the increasing scope of the community look at something like this. And then what other way to think about the image of a particular action or quote would be to say, well, how does this look or how does this sound if it was said by my enemy or my opposite, or the opposite of the enemy of the person who's doing this? Or if my own spouse, child, close family member did this or had this done to them. So looking at that image, okay, well, let's see, Rich works at GE and he fires all the females on his team. Okay, you kind of look at that. Well, I'd probably have to have some answering to do in front of my wife if I fired all the females. Again, with that only being the only information that she knows. Certainly at work, there would be a lot of questions, particularly from HR if I did that. In the news, oh yeah, that would definitely make news if this got wind, because it kind of goes against what GE is working towards of, we know that we are underrepresented by women in our highest echelons, and me getting rid of all the women would be counter productive to what we're trying to balance out here. And then if, my enemy at Philips or whatever did the same thing to Lena or Jocelyn, that I would say that looked bad. Right, so that's an example of, without knowing anything, that is one way to look at it. Not that I've ever done that or would do that, but that's an example.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, she might fire me. That actually has been a topic. She may want to upgrade me. Maybe that's another topic, but we'll take that another time on a different topic. Okay, any questions about image?
I think image really goes back to first impressions, because if you, I don't know, a year or so ago or some time ago, I looked up Elmbrook Church just as a search. Well, the first 3 articles that come up about Elmbrook Church is that their pastor's bad and was let go by the church because of his indiscretions and things like that. So from that, anybody that's searching would say, well, I don't want to go there. There's bad people there. And we get stuck in this framework of first impressions, and then that becomes our thought pattern for any future reference that we have with that person or with that subject.
Yep.
And I think it's unfair to have it happen that way.
Yeah, it's very fair, right? Again, that goes back to discernment. We need to be discerning, which means we look beyond just the face value.
Yes.
We have these three tests to try to think about it. And while we are open to, with more information, we're happy to change our opinion. Right?
We're talking about our group get-togethers where, Barb and I are at a table with 6 other people. Will you have a kind of a program for us to follow as far as questioning to try and keep it on track? Because I could see that easily going off rails at some point if you had someone that is a very strong personality in
Yes.
the group.
So we will definitely want to arm all of us with as many tools as possible to make sure we can host a productive discussion. So again, each of us, Ray and Barb, you're leading a table. There's 6 others there. Let's say the topic is immigration. We would have specific questions about immigration. We have a specific time period about, okay, we're doing dinner from this time to that time. We're doing icebreaker here from that time to that time. We have 5 questions and the team has to work through this. Oh, by the way, here's the reference to what we studied in How Would Jesus Vote about immigration. If you can help them navigate finding the solution to somewhere within the space, which is more friendly towards immigrants than less friendly, then that would be an example of how we want to equip each other. We would not want it to be a free-for-all. Because if they said, we're kicking all the immigrants out and anybody who looks like an immigrant and is non-white, etc., well, okay, that really wasn't what we covered in How Would Jesus Vote, and we would have let that group go kind of off course.
Well, yeah, and we'll have to get some guidelines, but the Zeitler Foundation, when they did this, one of the people kept track of time to make sure that, one person didn't dominate, as well as try to, if somebody started veering off, going off track, that person would gently remind the person, it sounds like you're kind of going off on a tangent. Let's try and keep your comments, directly on the issue that we're talking about. So that's a great point, Ray. We'll have to make sure.
That's why we
train the
definitely
guys
want to
on that.
work in pairs
Mhm.
so that we can help each other. Okay, so we had some maybe exercises. So the whole point of using intent, impact, and image is you assess all 3 for a particular situation. And if you get kind of 2 out of 3 bad ones, you kind of already know you're going to rule bad again on just what you know. 3 for sure is definitely bad. And if you get just 1 out of 3 that's bad, then it's a little bit open for interpretation, right? And you kind of need more discussion. That's pretty much a good way to assess it. It forces more than just the first impression, which is the Google search on Elmbrook that you brought up, Ray, and that you have to go deeper than that. I don't know if you wanted to just kind of talk about some examples of.
Well, so some examples that I thought of, one with Pelosi, for example. A few things that came to mind. First is at the State of the Union address when she ripped up the speech was, one issue that, and then another happened more recently when she was kneeling for, at the 8-minute 46-second in African garb. Some people saw that as pandering to the blacks. So I thought those examples were interesting to evaluate. And you could see, so I see one is what she did at the State of the Union. My
Okay,
assessment
so
was not really good.
Let's
personally.
walk through that.
Yeah, and then comparing it to what she did with the garb, the protests.
Okay, is everybody familiar with the situation where Nancy Pelosi ripped up the President Trump's speech at the State of the Union earlier in January, February this year?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go and assess the first I, which is intent. Who wants to kind of explain what her intent might have been here?
I would say her intent was to show displeasure and just animosity towards the president.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
good.
I think if they even asked her what her intention was, and I think her response, if I recall correctly, was that she did not think the words, some of the things that he said, he was being honest about, and, you know, she did rip it up, but it wasn't to be disrespectful to him. It was more a disrespect to some of the things that
The
he,
paper.
yeah, being,
So yeah, there were a lot of mistruths in that speech. It wasn't just a little, it was a lot, okay?
So I don't think,
but I don't think it was respectful at all in terms of,
Okay, that's image.
Oh, okay.
Intent, just stay on.
Yeah,
yeah, so I don't think we can we ever understand someone's intent for anything unless we ask them?
what,
So that's always the tough one,
right,
right?
well, so she was asked, but do we believe it? That's the question.
right.
So it's more about,
Based on repetition.
right,
Okay.
exactly, based off of repetition. Has she been
So that's a great
disrespectful?
example. So does she show a history of like calling the president disrespectful names? Is that something that, like, does she call him Crooked Donald? I don't know. I mean, this would be one way to assess
I
it.
don't think she likes him.
So not liking someone is not the same as having that history of saying stuff, right?
Or respects him, yeah.
Right. So let's keep going with that. And kind of we have, she could hate his guts and have been super disrespectful, or she could have been upset at the content of the speech, right? So these are two very good things for us to kind of figure out as good discerning Christians here. Okay, let's dive into this. Based on all that we know now, looking at the history of Nancy Pelosi and her interactions with Donald Trump, I'm trying to think of when I've heard her call him names.
Well, she certainly criticizes a lot of his actions. Like, I mean,
But
that's pretty
does she do
constant.
it in a disrespectful fashion? Because you can criticize without being disrespectful. But that's what I'm trying to understand. Is there a history of disrespect here, where you call names, where you use pejorative terms for him, where you swear?
Agree. Or is she just not agreeing?
Right,
Right.
right.
Just because you say this action was bad, I mean, we're making judgments about somebody's action was bad, and that's going to be a criticism. But it doesn't mean we're disrespecting her just by going through this exercise.
The thing I see, though, is when it came to the impeachment, she said that it was going to be a bipartisan address for everybody, but yet it seemed to be pretty one-sided when it came to the impeachment process.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Could be. Is that indicative of disrespect, though? As again, we're trying to keep this whole exercise on a particular action. Could be. Just helping us think through this. On ripping up the speech, the impeachment was certainly not bipartisan in the House. There was one lone dissenter in the Senate,
Mhm.
but it was very partisan.
But I mean, because she leads her party, there was things that were brought out that the day he was inaugurated was the start of the impeachment process, which came out in the news that somebody had said that. So it seems there was a lot of intent all along to not go along with things that the president wanted to have done.
Predetermined.
Yeah, so we'll have to hold on that one. Again, we're getting into the impeachment. I'm really trying to focus on, again, the ripping up of the speech.
But
Impeachment.
isn't it us looking at past actions and past thoughts and come up with
Right.
a,
So the past history, though, she actually held off her party from impeaching. There were definitely people that wanted to impeach him, but Democrats who wanted to impeach him, but she actually held them off for like 3 years, right? So that is, I would say we'd have a difficult time using that respect, because I think a reasonable person would say if she was really vengeful on it and disrespectful, they would have come at him right out from the get-go.
Or at least after the Mueller report.
Yeah.
They might have continued, yeah. The impeachment was about Ukraine, not about the Mueller report, so.
Okay, so on this one, I mean, just to keep going, it looks like none of us can come up with, and there may be some, but none of us can come up with it in our minds of direct history of a direct disrespect term. So this might be questionable. Okay, so let's kind of leave this one kind of vague. Like Kevin says, it's always going to be tough on intent, right? Because there's always, we have to judge it on circumstantial evidence. Only God knows truly a person's heart, and we have to look at the history here. The history shows that, okay, she doesn't like him for sure. But she's not called him like bad names or swore at him much as far as we can recall.
The thing I would look at, though, is in intent, again, was the fact that at the State of the Union, she knew it was being televised. She knew she was on camera. If she knew that, okay, under the table, she ripped up the speech because of her own feelings about it, but she visibly held it up in front so that the cameras would see it. And that probably, like they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And that's the image she wanted to project.
Yeah.
I can
I
certainly
would
see
agree
that.
with
Yeah.
that.
She definitely wanted it to be seen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I would say
That
there's
would
no
be-
question on
there's no
that. She
question.
wanted it to be seen.
Yeah.
She knew she was going to be on there. So
I would
definitely
agree.
wanting to send a message. Not necessarily sure if we can prove her intent was disrespect, but it was certainly to send a message. I don't think any of us would disagree with that.
Well, I think there's a difference between disrespecting his words and disrespecting him as a sitting.
Right. That's exactly what we're saying.
Yeah.
She said herself that she disrespected the word, right? But, she's not going to, well, I don't know, maybe she will. She's probably not going to say that I disrespect the president or the office of the presidency. So that one's a little hard to get directly from her.
Well, hasn't she been asked if she likes him or not? And she says, well, I pray for him every night.
Yeah, that she does. She does say she prays for him.
And of course, people don't like that. They say she's lying. I'm staying out. I'm not making, because I have not sought enough knowledge to make a comment on this. So, I mean, seriously, I think it really, because when things get said and you guys have taken the time to seek out the knowledge, that's why it's so good, because then you're able to bring that to the table, which can just put something out that's not true quickly.
Yeah. So I would say, since probably there is no cameras when she gets down on her knees at night and there's no microphone, we really don't know what she's saying.
Right.
Probably hard to say whether she is or she isn't here.
I mean, we're called to pray for our enemies.
Yeah.
I mean, because it is considered an enemy position, unfortunately, in our politics. So.
Yep. I don't think it's out of the question that she does, but
I
okay.
agree.
Let's move on to impact. All right, what was the impact here?
It was bad.
It was bad,
Yeah, just continue to polarize our country.
contentious.
Right.
Just bad.
Well, it garnered a lot of attention with the media.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, lots of speculation.
It was bad, and then image, it certainly looked
It's
bad.
bad.
So we got intent, not clear. Even if we gave her the benefit of doubt, said her intent was not disrespect. It was impact was clearly bad, and image was definitely bad. So we got 2 out of 3. So the ruling on that particular action is, let's
Bad.
do it together. I can't see everybody. Thumbs up.
Well, wait,
1, 2, 3.
Definitely bad.
Okay, so we're
I just had a quick comment. So if tearing up the speech, there's a portion of that her community that would find that appropriate, right? So even though, so how do you reconcile the opposite side of that spectrum, right? Where they think it's appropriate
that's a fantastic question too. In our context, since we're trying to bring people together, we would say, well, did that bring people together or not? That was clearly no. So
Right.
we would reject something like that. We would not want any of us to be ripping up stuff like this. That's why we will always say in our little group here, we can never bash Hillary, we can never bash Donald Trump. We have to try to stay focused on the facts and move people to say, okay, you might not like them, they're still the president or they're still the senator or whatever, but how do we work together? So, but even so, some of our group might liked it, but half of Americans didn't. So we would still have the situation where 2 out of the 3 of these things were bad, and we would give a thumbs down.
Makes sense.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay, let's do one more.
Oh, I think we need to go to the.
Oh, what? Oh,
spiritual
okay, yeah,
verses.
11:30. Okay.
Yeah, we need to move on. But I think that was a good exercise. I really,
Yep.
you guys got hopefully
Yeah, an
are
example
learning.
of
Yeah.
how to help people think, right?
Yeah.
Don't jump to first impressions, like you said, Ray, about that was a great example of looking at Elmbrook and 3 Google searches and Elmbrook's bad. Okay, now let's go to the 3 eyes here. This one was actually a pretty good example.
Mhm.
All right, last topic for today, spiritual versus legal. So in our class, when we met live, how do we always start our class, right?
Prayer.
We started with prayer and what,
Oh,
remember what we would read from the Bible?
reading the Constitution, reading.
And, love God.
Yeah, love God and love others. We read the 2 greatest commandments, which is all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands, right? To love your neighbor as yourself and love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so for us as Christians, we have to go to the Bible as our ultimate source of authority. Yet for America, our country, the ultimate source of authority is not necessarily the Bible, but the founding documents. In this case, the Declaration and the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution is referred to as the highest law of our land. And our Supreme Court, should any case ever make its way up to there, they ultimately really make, at the simplest level, they make a call. Is whatever is in debate, is it constitutional or not? That's all they do. They don't make laws. They don't enforce laws. They just determine, is this law constitutional or is it non-constitutional? Fundamentally, that's what they do. So I think we have to help our fellow Christians and us remember that, look, there's some intersection between the Bible and America, because many of our founding fathers were Christians, not all evangelicals, some were deists, whatnot, but many believed in a higher power. But even though there's some intersection in the Venn diagram, they are a little bit different. And so because there are 2 different realms, the spiritual realm governed by the Bible and the legal realm governed by our founding documents, specifically the Declaration and the Constitution, we have to remember that sometimes there could be things that are legal in America, but we use the term illegal in the Bible. And we're going to have to remember and take hope in the fact that God will judge those things that are, not in an intersection. And most likely remember that his judgment typically comes not on this earth, but in heaven, and keep that in mind. So here are some examples where we use words that are similar in both realms, but they have very different meanings. So we think of church as one thing, but yet the legal definition of church is another. And we have to operate in this way because this definition of spiritual church talks about how we relate to one another, right? All the believers were gathered together. They gave to everyone as they had need, selling their possessions and poor, right? The early church, it talks about discipleship and prayer, community, forgiveness, evangelism, discipleship. At the legal church definition, there are 14 definitions of the church in U.S. Legal, of which you must pass at least 8 of them in order to become a church, 7 plus 1. Those are very different. They don't talk about this. And the term church in a legal definition in the U.S., is it only applied to Christians or does it apply to other religions? applies to other religions, right? So even the first church of Satan could fit in this definition of church, as well as a Jewish temple, a Muslim mosque, I don't know what Buddhist temple to Hindus, whatever they worship in, that could all fit there. Another example of where we have a little bit of difference that's not in the intersection, but or an extreme, is how America is governed and how Israel was governed. Israel was governed as a theocracy, meaning their highest law in the land was direct communication to God, following him in the cloud and then the pillar of fire at night, and then revealed in the Ten Commandments through Moses. We are a democratic republic. So just for a little bit of preciseness, there is a slight difference between a democracy and a republic. So they both come from, Greek and Latin. So demo means the people, public means the people. Democracy means that the rule of the people, 50% plus one, enforces the laws or becomes the law. A republic stands for a representative. That's what the re says, re prefix, and there's a representative that represents the people. So we have a democratic republic that represents the people. A democracy is only governed by the 50% plus one. A republic has a constitution that respects the will of the majority but protects the rights of the minority. Meaning that in a true democracy, if 50% plus one said all Chinese people got to go, then that could happen. In a republic, if the people say 50% plus one say all Chinese people got to go, that's not going to happen, even if the majority of people want it, because this republic is based on a constitution. The Constitution defends the rights that all men are created equal. All right? And that term marriage.
Wait,
Oh.
did you guys get that? I just want to
Yeah.
make sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Good point. And then the term marriage is also a term that is common in both the spiritual realm and the legal realm, and we confuse it. Spiritual marriage, of course, implies that a husband loves their wife. It's the promise of children, the practice of oneness, even as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one, the idea of unity and sexual relations all embodied in that. The legal definition of marriage is simply
It's a
a
contract.
contract that
Can be
defines
enforced.
visitation rights, inheritance rights, says nothing about whether the two people involved here have sex or not. It says nothing about whether they love each other or not. It says nothing about whether they have to have unity or not. So it's very different definitions. And we have to make sure that as we talk to people in our groups, they understand when they're using terms, we have to be sure what realm we're using the appropriate word in. So let me pause here and questions and comments. This creates a lot of confusion at times.
Well, I think one of the things, sitting around a table with my Bible study women years ago when the marriage was between same sex was legalized and it was okay. And I was having such a hard time with that, and I just couldn't believe that our country was doing that. And one of the women had said, because the foundation is our Bible, we obviously would love everything to be governed as such. But we live in a country, as you said, that is based on the public and the group. And we can't, as Christians, force what we think on the whole, just as God doesn't force it for us to accept and obey. So that was something that really, I was like, maybe in the past we were fortunate that most things were done as such, and we liked that because it went along with what we believed. But we're called to be able to live in a world that, unfortunately, everybody's not going to agree with us. So it's how we act and how we respond to that. So it was just interesting because if the majority wants that to be able, and it may be outside of what God intended, but it just made a lot of sense to me, and it didn't make me for it. It just made me not as upset and a little more of understanding it.
Yeah, and I came from a different perspective only because one of our close friends who was a deacon at our church confided in us that, from a young age, she knew that she had those, lesbian tendencies. And so, but she had been closeted for, because just of growing up in an evangelical church. So I kind of came at it from a different realization that even for those even that are inside the church or outside the church, this was a hard topic, and I think it made it really hard for me to be against gay marriage. I feel like, okay, they should be entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And even if I think that their best happiness is to remain celibate, that's between them and God, and for God to show them that way, and not for our legal, to force it upon them.
Right.
And that's why I actually was more open to the idea. But that's really interesting.
Well said.
Yeah, other comments, questions?
So I'll paraphrase. I'll try to paraphrase. So John Adams at some point said, if it wasn't for sort of Christian values or morals, then the republic would fail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we go further and further away from those moral values, in which case happened to be Christianity for the founding fathers, be it some form or fashion, then the whole thing fails, right? So that I struggle with that because, yeah, and we can see it, right? I mean, when you lose your moral compass, then no holds are barred, right? It's a free for all. So yeah, it's a tough one, but.
So I agree, and I think that's why the founding documents, there's the intersection, because the founding documents embodied a lot of the values that were derived from the Bible, right? So the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So the concept of truth, an ultimate truth, is very important. And certainly we as Christians, like we studied last time about truth, is very important. That all men are created equal and they have the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The ideas of equality and life being important, liberty, freedom, and opportunity to pursue happiness, those are embodied here. And then even within the Constitution, it continues on with some more of those. I think.
But you can see why when we say that out loud at the time that the Constitution was written, and yes, it was brilliant as far as thinking things out and ruling. But at the time, we the people, and who was equal was not all the people. So I mean, it's just interesting. It may have been on the premise of what's out of the Bible, but I've always had a hard time with slavery and thinking how people could think that Christian, and it just is. So we're human and we make mistakes, and so I don't know. The Constitution is good, but when it says all men are treated equal, it was not women,
Yes.
not people of different color. Yeah, so
That's actually a fantastic conversation piece I had with that. Remember, I'm ashamed, but that time I cried in class, which I never cry, but I just couldn't. So I had that discussion with an African-American brother on this. The Constitution was not written about me as a black man. It was not written for women. It was just white males. And, so I didn't have an appreciation of how much pain he had. But, then coming back and saying, but so would you say we take that out? Do you not want it to be in there? can't the Constitution of the meaning, be interpreted a little bit more better? I actually think that if you read more about Jefferson, he was against slavery and wanted them freed, even though he still had some remaining slaves. So he looked forward to the day. And then I did more digging after the conversation. Is he knew that the North could not beat Great Britain on their own. They had to get all 13 colonies to be on board with this. So he said, we will deal with the concept of all men, including black men and women, later. Let us make sure that we're 13 united against Great Britain. And that was the order of which he was trying to solve things.
Yeah, kick the can down the road, basically. Right?
Yeah, it was not so much kicking the can, because it was a huge debate. So if you read some of the history, it was a huge debate, because some people really wanted to have the fight on slavery now. Jefferson put his foot down and said, we can't, because if we try to have this fight, we will never secure the South. We will all lose and our country will never be. So it was kind of a pragmatic kicking the can down the road. And yes, it took 100 years, but in 1865, they finally dealt with it and solidified that in the Civil War at great cost. So I think, again, knowing a deeper story, which is why I love having these discussions together, we can help understand things a little bit better.
Yeah, so the example that I wanted to talk about, which is I think very relevant right now on the spiritual versus legal, is the issue of transgenderism, because I think that is very, there's so many elements to it, but I think it's important, because, we had a discussion with our friend who said, transgender females are going to be competing against my daughter in gymnastics, and he's praying that won't happen. And, I can see, there's issues like that happening right now. And in the education world, the him, they, gender identity. And then what President Trump just did, revoking the executive order. So now transgenders are not a protected class when it comes to the ACA. So these are relevant issues, and I think that's really important that I thought we could talk about spiritual versus legal.
Okay, so what would you like to?
So what do you guys think, looking at it from the lens of a spiritual versus legal situation for those who are transgender and they're trying to fight for their rights, and how do we thread the needle to help find a common ground that we could still live together in a more peaceful way? What do you think is the best way to do it, knowing that there are transgenders who exist? And maybe for the Christian, we look at that and we might think, okay, well, maybe it's due to sin or a mental illness or whatnot, so how do we navigate through this spiritual versus legal so that we can live together and work through that, in terms of like specific rights? So
is it like the example that you just gave? Maybe we focus on that.
Okay.
So it is now, with the executive order in place by President Trump, you can discriminate and say, I refuse to provide health care to a transgender person. So is that what you want to discuss and say, okay, what do we as Christians think about that?
Well, I mean, an easier one is about sports, right? Well, let's just take that one.
Okay, I'm kind of biased, but
okay. Well,
okay. No.
I mean, there's a sports one. Like, how do you handle
okay.
it?
We can
Because they're
start with
talking about
sports.
that.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you handle?
Didn't Connecticut just pass a law that said that transgender people could not compete in sports, so that you wouldn't have transgender men competing against girls in sports? So I think that's starting from that standpoint too, that some states are recognizing the inequality of having a man who claims to be a woman want to participate in women's sports, having, lack of a better term, a better physical ability to perform.
If they passed that, because I remember my brother was discussing this with me, and I said, well, he was telling me Connecticut allowed transgenders to compete. So transgender men who became women competing as women. I said, that's not fair. And he said, well, it's happening. And I said, well, it'll never pass the state Supreme Court. They are going to strike it down because it's pretty obvious. So
Yeah.
if they did that, that's
Yeah, it looks like it
that's
was.
great. I didn't know that, Ray.
It
Thank you for sharing.
violated civil rights of female athletes. So, yep.
Okay, so that
Yeah,
one.
it's fairly recently that Connecticut made that ruling.
Okay, yeah,
So
I
that's
didn't know
good.
that. That's good.
That's
That's what I predicted to my brother when he was worried.
Mhm.
Okay.
I guess one of the things that troubles us is the fact that prisoners in state prison have been getting sex conversion surgeries at taxpayers' expense.
That's
And
okay.
that's not necessarily where I want my tax dollars going.
Mhm.
Yep, let's talk about that one.
Would you rather it go to like help them? Because like mental illness, like that they need to be converted back, or
I would say that
using, or what do you think?
understanding their mental capacity and what has driven them to feel that way,
Mhm.
because as Christian, God created us human and female and male,
Mhm.
and to disagree with God's arrangement is kind of against the Bible from my perspective. From a worldly perspective, I guess anything goes, but that's my viewpoint on it.
And how do you reframe that into okay, now put on the legal sense of that without spiritualizing it? What would be a different way to reframe that?
Well, most people that I have heard about that have that issue or are struggling with that, it comes from issues that have dealt from childhood of not being accepted or something like that. So there's emotional things that go along with that, which I think from a emotional standpoint, a therapist or someone would be able to help them understand that better from that perspective.
Right.
So I would, from a legal standpoint, so I'm kind of agreeing with Ray on the spiritual. But now if we go do the legal lens, I would say, is there a clear medical case from a panel of doctors? And I would imagine that a panel of doctors should review the health of prisoners that agree this is, life-threatening or mentally threatening. I mean, whatever the definition is, I don't know the exact one that necessitates that, and that would only be a last resort, because I can't see the gender identity struggle being life-threatening for a prisoner. But I could be wrong. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about this.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna do a parallel. Okay, I was born very short. And I think that I'm like, gee, I wish I was like much taller. And I'm like feeling
Okay, me
like,
too. But
I'm like, like I think like I'm just saying, like I could have real mental health issues because I just see myself as so inadequate because people look down on me, not just literally, but like from a different standpoint, lesser than of.
I used to feel that way until I went to Japan, and then I got in the elevator. I felt really tall.
It's all about reframing. Thank you, Ray.
Well, anyways, but that's so I kind of see it being more of an elective, right? Like, okay, I don't know that it functionally, just because you don't have the body parts of how you feel, that should be something that I think. I mean, from a
Offer counseling, not like limb lengthening.
well, right, yeah, or yeah. So I guess this is where I think it's an interesting discussion to have.
I guess from a legal standpoint, I can see where if you feel like a woman and you want to wear women's clothing and you want to look like a woman, that's a personal idea, preference from that standpoint. And there are people that do that. But when it comes to I don't accept what God made me, so I want to change it, that seems to cross a line, I think, from my perspective. I mean, in this world, sin is sin.
Right.
And we kind of categorize sin. One thing, I don't believe in gay marriage, basically,
Mhm.
because I think the Bible speaks directly to that.
Mhm.
And I don't agree with murder, but if gay marriage is acceptable, then maybe murder is acceptable, because that's a sin as well. So I don't know.
Hmm.
Kevin, Don, any thoughts?
I'm going to punt on those topics.
I would agree more with Lena on the side of it being an elective. Like, it's not a life-threatening situation. So if someone wanted to, change their sex and they're not in prison, it really doesn't affect anybody but them. It doesn't affect another human being. And if they want to spend their money to do that, I don't agree that it's right. And but they're not hurting anyone. But if in prison and you're taking other people's money to make that happen, now you are impacting other people. You're also then impacting, because if you're in a male prison and now you're a female, now that changes that whole situation and impacts people, just like it does with, in athletics. You're now competing with other people, and it impacts other people. I think that's when the legal side of it has to step in, when it's impacting another person.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Rich and I had this discussion, and we realized that so I think it's really important. So the word sex, is being, I think they're trying to redefine sex, right? The sex in terms of like male, female, and versus gender identity, right? Which is, how do you identify male, female? And I think this is where this in terms of science, I think we need to follow the science. But it doesn't mean that we discount how somebody feels.
Right.
What the challenge is we have to always remember to be more precise with the terms that you're using, so that they don't feel that they're not being listened to. And this is
Right.
where the threading the needle comes, as where I think we can help to facilitate a more meaningful discussion, rather than saying, no, you feel like a female, you cannot be a female because you were born male. We have to
So if this was a
framework.
topic, this won't be, but if this was a topic in our discussion groups, we would have to help people understand, okay, guys, for our group, we're going to be very precise because we find it's helpful to talk better. Sex, we're going to define as biological sex. You're either XX or XY. That's how you were created. That is called sex. It is a physical, biological, chromosomal thing. But gender identity is kind of a mental, psychological thing. So it's independent of your biological sex, and it could be how you perceive yourself. That's gender identity. So those are two different things. And just my comment on the prison surgery, as I'm kind of with Ray and what Dawn said, is you guys, if you can, there's no medical necessity as far as I know, so I wouldn't want that either. But certainly we want to help you, like in the case of shortness, cope with that. As long as you're not taking taxpayer dollars to do this controversial subject. It's just like abortion. We don't do taxpayer dollars for abortion either because it's so controversial.
Right. But maybe counseling, because it is traumatic
Yeah,
to
provide
have an
some,
unwanted
because it's mental
pregnancy.
health.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I did read someplace that the transgender community wanted to eliminate the word woman as well.
Exactly, yeah. I agree. That's why I think this is so relevant. And how can we speak with the transgender community in a way where we can actually try to find common ground? So I have friends in that sphere, and I really look forward to having a meaningful discussion with them. Um, so,
You mean they don't want the word woman at all?
well, so I know, so one of our friends has a transgender child. And so I just, I want to test our approach,
principles,
our
yeah.
principles to see if there's a way for us to find common ground so that it's not so divisive, right? That's what I'm hoping for.
So I think back to the two topics we were talking about here, the sports thing, I think we just resolved. So thank you for sharing that, Ray. The Supreme Court in Connecticut just said they can't do that. And then the other thing was, what do we as Christians think about, should we be allowed to have our healthcare professionals not provide care to somebody just because they're transgender?
No.
That would be a good discussion.
Mhm.
So we hear no from Dawn.
I mean, you're talking about any healthcare. That's what you're saying just happened.
No. This is the hypothetical situation. The real life situation Ray brought up, which I didn't know, was the Connecticut Supreme Court just ruled that transgender men who become women can't compete in women's sports.
Okay.
That
Cannot?
Cannot.
cannot.
Okay.
Unfair. It inhibits the civil rights of the women, the regular women who are competing. So the second question that we set out on this issue as an example of spiritual versus legal is, okay, legally, should it be okay for a Christian to not provide care to a transgender person?
Oh,
Oh,
cannot.
no.
Okay.
I mean,
So we had one no from Dawn. No, you should provide.
Wait. So would you say that again, that a Christian should have the right if they should provide health care? Is that what you're saying?
Right. This is
The right to not help them?
President Trump's executive order changing
Right.
the rules for the HHS, where President Obama clarified that, no, you need to provide care to transgender people. This is not a religious exemption one. President Trump's executive order removed that and said, leaves it up to Christians to decide whether they want to provide care or not to someone who violates their quote unquote religious conscience.
well, that's sort of the same vein as the baker that won't bake the cake for the marriage, right?
Except
I
for
mean,
it's a life or death situation possibly.
so there goes your religious liberties, right? I think that's the dilemma.
Aren't there religious liberties to care about every life?
I'm not
I mean,
I'm
that's
not
a
saying I don't
religious
disagree.
thing.
I mean, you should, yeah. If I'm a doctor, then yes, I'm gonna help everybody, right? Regardless.
And that's an oath.
But at the same time, if I'm a doctor that is more legalistic, maybe, I don't know, and should his rights be infringed for the rights of others, right? It's a tough one.
Well, but I think the oath that the doctors take is they will provide health care to anyone, right? I mean, they will help anybody in need, right? I don't know.
That
Are
is
we
the essence
talking
of
about,
the Hippocratic oath. Go ahead.
about medical care just in general, or are we talking about medical care to perform transgender operations?
Medical care in general.
Yes, in general. Most Christians,
Well, I think they deserve medical care, same as anybody else.
Right.
So that would be the position that I would take as well. So those who think that Christians should continue to provide health care to transgender people, not necessarily surgery, thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, so even though legally we have the ability now to say, no, we as Christians don't want to provide it, spiritually we look with compassion and say we would still want to do that because, like what Don said, God cares about other people, regardless of whether they're sinners or not. I think that.
so did Trump change that? Like he was doing that for the Christians?
I think kind of.
I think it sounded like
It's a religious liberty play.
Right.
because it was really more Obama who put it in there to clarify. Again, it's executive order, so not as powerful as law, but he clarified to the HHS, look, I'm looking to you to, when we say you can't discriminate on the order of race, ethnicity, creed, country of origin, gender, etc., this is inclusive of people who are transgender. By Trump removing that, he's saying, oh, you can, because transgender is not protected anymore, you can deny healthcare to transgender if you want. That's what.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess it's probably.
A transgender person might say, I need a sex change. You know, I need it for my mental health. I need it for whatever. As a Christian doctor, I want the ability to say no.
I think that's still okay, because that's still kind of an elective surgery.
Right. And I mean, most Christians, I mean, if they're going to go on that, don't even do that kind of surgery anyway. So why would you want someone to do that surgery that doesn't know how to do it
Right.
or doesn't practice it? I mean, it's not like
Right.
it's
It's
just
more, because it was so vague now and broader, you could have a situation where maybe someone who was very, as Kevin said, legalistic would say, I don't want to provide mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR on this transgender women because it violates my religious conscience. And this could be a life-saving situation. And I would probably say, no, I think God would want you to save that person's life. And during surgery, you're doing CPR.
Right.
And I want to clarify, and because I want to, what I think though is what Obama did was provide the avenue for healthcare to be required to care for transgenders' health in those other elective ways, right? So that's really the change, not so much like, you know, you have a heart attack, you can't, you know, I don't think that's the intention. I think it really related to caring for a transgender person in the way that it helped that transgender person be cared for with hormone therapy or, you know, sex change, that type of thing, and opening up the door for the ACA to be required to do that in some way, shape, or form. So
Okay, we'll have to
do
research
some
that, 'cause
research on
those are
that.
two very,
because I
this
think
is
that's
why,
really what-
things in the,
yeah, we'll have to be, this is why it's so important for us to help people become very precise.
Mhm,
right.
Tell, even with the two of us, we're not quite sure exactly
Right.
what this is saying.
mhm.
It would be two very different answers here.
True.
All right,
Okay, I
that's
think our
good.
time is up. Very good discussion. Any final thoughts, questions, comments here from anybody?
Are you going to pursue seeing if we could have a meeting at church in a couple weeks?
I don't know if they'll let us have a meeting at church, but even if we can't, I would love to meet live with all you guys. So depending on who's comfortable, we could host it at one of our houses. We could meet at a place that allows us to meet. But I would like to meet live. I don't know if any of you have heard that Elmbrook is allowing us to meet live there yet, though. I have not.
Well, when they first opened back weeks ago, they did say that they would be open for small groups and such, and the staff, they just weren't going to have the congregation meeting. I mean, next week on Father's Day, they're doing a Father's Day
But it's
picnic and
outside.
car show. I mean, it is outside. But I do believe there's small group meetings happening inside of Elmbrook.
So I
Okay,
would
good.
consider us small because we're like 10 or less. So
Let's see.
plan on meeting live next time then. And we'll check if we can, I'm sure we won't have a problem securing a room. We'll just verify that it's okay. But it would be nice to meet live.
Hey, a thumbs up to that idea.
All
Yeah.
right.
Okay, great. So with that, Ray, could I ask you to close us in prayer?
Sure. Father, we just come to you with concerns. We come to you with desires to help make our world a better place and to support all the children that you have created. And Lord, we just pray that you would open our eyes and help us to discern what we should do and what we shouldn't do with regards to communication with others, and just lead this group forward, Lord, and help us to each to have a blessed week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you guys. Great discussion. You have a good rest of the Sunday. We'll talk to you later, okay?
Today.
Bye. Yeah, it'll just record.